Our church's Helpline is incredibly evil. If you've watched this, you probably already know what the Helpline is. I'll give you a brief rundown if you don't. The church maintains a line that people who are bishops, branch presidents, stake presidents, other leaders can call when abuse or other serious things have been disclosed to them to get some guidance on what needs to happen next, not only in how to support the people who are there, but in how to fulfill their legal responsibilities. Some people have said, like, well, gosh, shouldn't the legal responsibility just be like, well, go report it to the police? And I kind of love like the common sense, like, let's not be dumb, people, let's just do the right thing. But it really, really lacks an understanding of the nuance of the differences of law, even from one state to the next. And what is reportable here is not reportable there. And what's required in reporting here is not required reporting somewhere else. So yes, the church maintains a helpline that church leaders can call to get help with really, really tricky situations, not just legal help, but including legal help. In this section, we're going to talk about how this podcast discusses our church's way of handling sexual abuse cases. They talk through a number. I think there's about 5 cases total that they talk through, and some of them in greater detail than others. The first one that they mention, it's a brief mention of a case where a member was sentenced to 5 years in jail for abuse. And he makes the point that congregations should not be left to do their own kind of in-house investigations because there are too many conflicting interests. And he is correct about that. That is not wrong. If you've ever been around someone who has committed a terrible crime and you kind of had that like, what? That guy did it? I can hardly believe it. That's a really normal human reaction. And the people who are around someone who has done something terrible probably shouldn't be expected to have a much clearer reaction than that. They're allowed to have the really human response of shock. But that shock also makes them the people who are not in a position to investigate whether or not this person actually did anything wrong. They're just too close to the situation and their own emotions are involved. And that seems pretty obvious. In our church, we don't do like in-house at the ward level investigations into sexual abuse. That's not how things are done. However, what this podcast is doing is using that fact that I very much agree with. Don't do your own in-house investigations. He uses that to say that our church's Helpline is incredibly evil. If you've watched this, you probably already know what the Helpline is. I'll give you a brief rundown if you don't. The church maintains a line that people who are bishops, branch presidents, stake presidents, other leaders can call when abuse or other serious things have been disclosed to them to get some guidance on what needs to happen next, not only in how to support the people who are there, but in how to fulfill their legal responsibilities. Some people have said, like, well, gosh, shouldn't the legal responsibility just be like, well, go report it to the police? And I kind of love like the common sense, like, let's not be dumb, people, let's just do the right thing. But it really, really lacks an understanding of the nuance of the differences of law, even from one state to the next. And what is reportable here is not reportable there. And what's required in reporting here is not required reporting somewhere else. So yes, the church maintains a helpline that church leaders can call to get help with really, really tricky situations, not just legal help, but including legal help. This is different than conducting an in-house investigation. His claim is the helpline is there to keep the church out of legal trouble. And I would say, yes, absolutely, the helpline is there to keep the church out of legal trouble. And do you know the best way to stay out of legal trouble? The best way to stay out of legal trouble is to obey the law. So the helpline is there to help bishops and stake presidents and others obey the law where they live, to fulfill their legal requirements. That is the mischievous mission of the helpline, is to help the church stay out of legal trouble by not breaking any laws. That's what they are doing. However, in this podcast, it is skewed as the helpline is going to conduct their own almost 911 style investigation, that's the role they are trying to fill, that they are going to do their own kind of follow a criminal trail and see if this guy really did it. So to prove this point, they tell the story of a woman named Jade. It is a heart-wrenching story. I'm not going to tell you all the details. And even in the podcast, he says he is not going to tell you all the details because it's incredibly sad. This woman, I don't think Jade is her real name. I hope that she is happy and healing. I hope that she knows all kinds of goodness. She deserves our prayers and our compassion. None of what we are about to talk about takes anything away from the legitimacy of the story, her legitimacy to complain about what has happened to her, or her right to goodness and happiness. That is not what this is about. I'll tell you the story. So there's a woman named Jade, and she was married to her husband in the temple. She remains a faithful member well into their marriage, and he starts to fall away from the church. The woman has a sister. The sister is 8 years old, and this little girl ends up moving in with her sister, with Jade is the sister, and her husband. And unbeknownst to Jade, her husband starts sexually abusing this little girl. The amount of guilt that Jade feels over this is just understandably crippling. The damage that this did to this 8-year-old girl is absolutely awful. When Jade finds out that this has been happening, she feels incredibly distraught, and she wants to talk to her bishop for support. She doesn't say that she's going to her bishop to get him to do an investigation on her husband. She's going for support. The bishop tells her two things. She ultimately, her and her husband end up going to the bishop, and he tells both of them two things. One, because they have a temple marriage, it is possible to have an eternal perspective on what has happened and work through this. The bishop tells Jade that it is ideal that she is able to stay with her husband and work it out, but that she does not have to. He is not saying, this is the word of the Lord, you must stay with this husband who has committed this abuse. He says, in ideal circumstances, you guys would be able to work this out, and that your eternal marriage is not ruined over this. He's expressing this hopefulness to them, while at the same time saying, and that might not be what happens. The second thing the bishop says to them is that the couple should report the abuse to the police. Now, this case happened in New Zealand, and in New Zealand, as in many places in the United States, clergy are not mandated reporters of abuse. If they learn about abuse during a confession, meaning the person who has committed the abuse is there in the meeting saying to them, I did this thing, which to his credit, Jade's husband admits this is what he had done. That is considered a confession, and it's something to be held sacred, not because we don't want to protect children, but because the man has come to terms with the idea that he has committed a crime and he has spiritual needs that will need to be tended to in the middle of this process he is going to go through. That does not exempt him, and you can see from the bishop's words, it does not exempt him from also facing consequences from the police. However, the bishop isn't going to be the one to make the phone call. Interestingly enough, in this situation, the bishop is not the only one who knows the information. Jade, the wife, adult woman in this house, also knows the information. So the bishop implores them, and her specifically, to go to the police. Jade doesn't do this. The bishop, his hands are tied. He can't do it. He would like her to do it. Jade does not listen to the advice of the bishop. She does not go to the police. Instead, what she does is she contacts her husband's family and asks them if he can go stay with them for a while. They say yes, they come and pick him up, and they take him away to another town in New Zealand where he's going to stay with his family while Jade and her sister figure some things out. Many of his family members live in this other town. Most of them are members of the ward, and they do what families often do, which is they circle around their family member and they try to support him and protect him. They do not seem to believe that their family member could have done this. I think you and I can stand on the outside of this and say, what? Why didn't they believe this little girl that this was happening? This is terrible. And sometimes this is how families operate. We refuse to believe that our family member could have done this. So that's the situation Jade's husband finds himself in. The bishop of the ward where the abuse had happened calls the bishop in the husband's new ward to warn them, this is what's going on here. You need to know about this. I've instructed them to call the police. As far as I know, they have not. So the bishop in the new ward finds about it, and he gives them the same advice. You should call the police. I cannot do that. but you are absolutely free to do it. Jade still does not do it. Her husband does not do it. For their part, the church says we are going to call a disciplinary council and take care of things on the spiritual side. We do not have the authority in this situation to take care of the legal bits, though Jade could have started that process. We don't have the authority to run the secular courts, but we will take care of the side that we can take care of. So they call a disciplinary council for him. And they meet. They find that it would be best for this man if he refrained from most church activities for about 3 months. Things at this point are not going well in the marriage, understandably so. Jade believes that trying to stay with her husband was a mistake, and she becomes very angry that this is the outcome of the disciplinary council. She really, really, really wanted the church to be able to dole out a punishment to him that would somehow be equal to what the court system or the police could dole out to him, but it's not. They're giving spiritual guidance to a man who is in spiritual crisis. Their goal there is to get him back to spiritual health. The goal there is not punishment for his crime of child abuse. That's a secular court issue, and that is who should have been handling that. And Jade is the one who should have made the phone call. I cannot imagine her pain in being in that situation, and she is still the one who should have made the phone call. Another claim here goes back to very early in their marriage. Jade has an affair pretty early on in their marriage, and she ends up in a disciplinary council. This is before any of the abuse had happened, and she was given 6 months of not taking the sacrament and not participating in some activities of the ward. Again, a disciplinary council is trying to get a member out of spiritual crisis and get them back on a good spiritual path. They're not trying to dole out secular discipline. And in her case, they felt like a 6-month restriction on taking sacrament was going to really help her come to terms with, is this the spiritual path you want to stay on or isn't it? So that is what happens to her. When her husband receives 3 months from his disciplinary council, she is irate and basically compares it to a punishment. Why do I get punished for 6 months for having an affair, but he only got punished for 3 months for abusing a child? But she is conflating something there. A disciplinary council is not a court of law that's going to tell you how long you have to go to jail for. Asking someone to refrain from taking the sacrament is not a punishment. That's part of an entire package of things to get that person to think about, what path are you on? What path would you like to be on? What do you need to change in your life? Her confusion about it being a punishment makes her incredibly angry. There's another issue here as well. Yeah, on the outside, that seems real weird that she got 6 months of probationary church attendance and he only got 3 months, as if unequal consequences are not handed out anywhere else in life. And that just isn't true. Yes, these were very uneven outcomes. However, even the secular courts, even our beloved court system hands out uneven punishments for the same crime sometimes. Our courts do not hand out equal punishments. Last year, 2024, in the state of Utah, there was a case that finally, their final appeal had gone through. The original crime had happened years ago, but finally got through the appellate court. The case is the state versus Corey. Corey was a first-time sexual abuser. He got 15 years in prison. And that sentence is withheld in the appellate court. While another case involving a Utah therapist who had admitted his own words to abusing several young family members, that case got dismissed. He didn't even go to court. The charges got dropped. In one case, the abuser, first-time abuser, gets 15 years. And in another case, a guy who's abused multiple family members for years gets nothing, not even a slap on the hand from the court. That was 2024 here in Utah. The idea that all consequences of something should be equal, it does not make sense. I wish that it did. I wish there was this great leveling, even way to hand out punishments, and that is not what any of us live under. That is just what it is. So let's not pretend like the church is the only place where consequences might be handed out unevenly. So Jade, she's upset that the church council wasn't harsh enough, not upset enough to call the actual police, though, which she still absolutely had the ability to do. It's a tragic story. They tell another story of another abuse case that does not end up in the criminal going to jail. The abuser was a member of the church. The victim was an adult when they reported, and eventually that adult victim decides they don't want to pursue charges. And so the case falls apart. No victim who wants to pursue charges, no case. Right? This is actually a rather common occurrence. More often than not, victims can go back and forth on, I want to say things, I don't want to say things. That's the normal case for the vast, vast majority of victims. This is a case where a kid was abused. He grows up to be an adult. He initially wants to level charges against his abuser, and he changes his mind. This happens. This podcast tells this story in an effort to say, because he was a member of the church, the abuser, the victim was too, but because the abuser was a member of the church, the victim had been pressured to not go through with the charges, as if the reality that victims have an incredibly ambivalent feelings about, do I want to go to court and in front of a courtroom of people explain what has happened to me? Most victims do not want to do that. And this guy didn't. And yet, in this podcast, they're taking that and blaming it on the church. It does not seem fair. This is a bit of an aside. The vast majority of abuse cases never make it to court. The group RAIN, they stand for Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. They say that for every 1,000 abuse crimes, 30% are reported to police, 5% lead to arrest, 2% lead to a conviction, and something less than those ever actually go to jail. So to say like, well, gosh, the church is the only terrible ones in handling abuse, like, no, this is an incredible problem that all around the globe people are grappling with. How do we actually get justice for some of these scenarios? It's not a Latter-day Saint specific problem. In this episode, they introduce the Bisbee, Arizona case, which may or may not be well known to you. It's a terrible case. What happened to these kids is awful. I know a lot about these cases, and I have thought of these children frequently. I pray for their health and happiness. They talk through this case, and in my next segment, we'll get into more details about that. But they talk through this case as if it is the grandest proof that the church doesn't care about children. However, what they completely fail to mention is that the court found that the case should be thrown out, that the church was not doing what they were accused of doing, which was protecting the abuser and not protecting the children. The court dismissed the case. This isn't the church manipulating somehow their way out of something. This is a case that's been in the courts for quite a while, and some incredibly rigorous, hard battles around this, and it's been very watched by many people. The court said, no, this isn't what you say that it is. Does the podcast tell you that? No, they don't. They just tell you this case is the one that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the church protects abusers and not children, despite the fact that the court said that that was not what happens. In our next segment, we're going to talk through some of the claims that are made regarding that Arizona case, as well as a couple of others. The podcast offers them as proof that the church completely devalues children and only wants to protect abusers. Many things they say are true, and then those true things are used to make conclusions that are far from the truth and actually kind of offensive in many cases. We'll cover all of that in the next segment.